Despite the utter chaos that normally accompanied such a boarding action, the human appeared unperturbed, slowly and dutifully continuing about their daily tasks, as if they had barely even registered that their ship had been taken over at all. The raiders who had commandeered the Earthship were gleeful at how little resistance they had encountered. The ship appeared to be little more than a drone craft, the only living sentient aboard being the human, who offered no resistance and no fight to prevent them from taking over such spoils. However, the raiders were also struggling to determine how best to enrich themselves off of their newly acquired prize, as the ship lacked weapons, technological secrets, and barely possessed little more than a functional but unostentatious reactor and hyperspeed array. The hyperspeed array had been carefully disabled, and from what their engineer could tell, it was work done well before the ship had been boarded. Fortunately, it would prove to be a simple, if somewhat time-consuming, repair to make. The only cargo appeared to be great vats of some kind of viscous fluids, one clear and one amber-colored, but chemically they appeared almost identical apart from some impurities they could detect in the amber liquid. The ship was also curiously absent of recreational facilities or even a mess hall, instead having a wastefully large space that appeared to have been converted into some kind of greenhouse, with hundreds of brightly colored plants that were apparently native to Earth but carried little value or use medically or commercially apart from minimal aesthetic value. It appeared to the captain of these pirates that they had essentially stolen a worthless trash barge, especially as some of these strange liquid cargo appeared to be contaminated and impure. The captain was absolutely livid, and so their first mate and second in command of the raiders' vessel was attempting with limited success to browbeat the unperturbed human. "You must have something of value on this ship?" she said in frustration, gesturing with a loaded laser pistol beneath the wrinkled man's nose. "Some kind of new weapon or technology? Something we can sell instead of all this clear and yellow crap?" The human, aggravatingly, just chuckled quietly as he pruned at an errant rose stem. They had initially manacled him and contained him until he insisted that he'd be allowed to continue his duties, else the ship's integrity could suffer. Sure enough, after less than an hour of confinement, some minor alarms began going off and the ship started listing heavily to one side. He was allowed to continue his duties, but to the pirates' bafflement, it appeared to be just minor upkeeping, cleaning here and there. They never saw him touch a control panel or unscrew so much as a single circuitry manifold, and yet the ship's errors seemed to correct themselves and the vessel righted itself. "So you think this is funny, do you?" the first mate barked, both sets of jaws snarling and dripping with anticipation of being able to end the infuriating human's existence as soon as they figured out how to make this capture worth the trouble. "Oh, I think I just have a unique view of the situation," he said with a smile. "Besides, I'm just a caretaker, I'm afraid. I wouldn't know much about the inner workings or anything valuable within." The first mate narrowed her eye but was distracted by a call from one of her crewmates who had been messing with a panel on the side of the greenhouse. "That contaminated gunk is in here too!" Loping over, the first mate could see that indeed more of the contaminated yellow fluid was almost dripping from the panel that had been removed. She thought she saw some signs of movements as well, small scuttling creatures, vermin of some kind that shrank away from the edges. She was stunned, but then began a rolling bark of laughter as the confused crewmates stared at her. "Your ship is infested. You've got some manner of pest that is polluting your cargo and stuffing up your engineering. I'm surprised the ship is still able to fly with all the gunk I can see in there," she said, reaching in and pulling out a piece of what appeared to be effluents or nesting material from the pests. For the first time almost since they had boarded the vessel, they saw a flinch from the human, who winced as she tossed the pale geometric patterned wedge of waste material off to one side. Chuckling at the human's newfound sensitivity, the first mate kicked the glossy chunk across the metal flooring to slide to the human's feet. "You say you're a caretaker. Why don't you make yourself useful and clean out these panelways? We won't be able to do much to make repairs with all this junk in the way." The human frowned. "I can't do that. The bees wouldn't like it." Not recognizing the word, the first mate strode forward, catching the human by the shoulder and thrusting up to pin him against the side of one of the racks of vibrant earth plants. Her lungs were already beginning to get irritated from the small puffs of spores that the plants appear to emit, causing her to cough and growl in frustration. "Oh, so you care about the vermin contaminating your ship? I'm surprised humans ever made off your own world if you're so unwilling to inconvenience a mindless pest." As she spoke, a bee landed on her gesturing hand, and she laughed. Grinning cruelly to the human, she smashed it between two outstretched fingers, saying, "How do you feel now, weakling? I'm squishing up one of your beloved pests. Won't my captain be so proud of me for..." She cut off with a screech of pain, shaking her hand ineffectually as she howled in anger and fury. The human was released, dropping to the floor with a groan as the first mate examined her hand, still howling and roaring with agony. "What is this? What did that thing do to me?" The human smiled grimly. "I think you'll find that while I may not possess much in the way of defenses, my crewmates are not so ill-equipped." Indeed, for the first time since they had boarded the vessel, the raiders heard a voice come to life on the ship's intercoms, a humming and many-layered speech that spoke almost in perfect unison. Looking up towards the vaulted ceiling of the room, he intoned, "Queen and kin, I think we've entertained these guests long enough. Wouldn't you agree?" "Agreed, Caretaker. Are you prepared to be our harvestman?" The old human smiled, a tinge of sadness at the corners of his mouth. "I am, but I ask that you act with precision instead of anger." "As you wish, Caretaker." Then the voice cut out, and a deafening hum began to fill the corridors of the ship. As the Caretaker returned to pruning the flower garden, screams soon drowned out the omnipresent humming, until those too faded. Noticing the return to silence, the Caretaker carefully pulled a tray with a white linen cloth across it on a small cart, and began slowly pushing it along the corridors. He had a small dustpan and broom, and as he came across the handful of bodies of deceased pirates who had not managed to escape to their ship and flee back into space, surrounding them were dozens or even hundreds of bees as well, perished from their valiant effort to defend their home. He carefully swept the bees up, diligently arranging them on the white linen and careful rows. Then, after completing his rounds, he carefully draped the edges of the linen across the ranks of the dead and placed it within a wooden box, a facsimile of the hives that were once built on distant Earth, before carefully placing it within the launch tube. He keyed in some commands to the keypad, and the ship oriented slightly before jettisoning the stylized coffin, the distant destination of this system's sun promising an inevitable cremation. The voice of the hive returned, saying quietly, "This is well, Harvestman. We are again grateful for your service." He smiled, eyeing where an errant laser shot had burned a hole through an electrical conduit and the wiring within, seeing bees carefully swarming and repairing the metal wiring before protecting it with a coating of wax. "I am simply a caretaker, Queen and kin, and I thank you again for allowing me aboard your vessel as such." Then his eyes returned to the forms of the dead pirates, still slowly bleeding out onto the floors. He sighed and began dragging their corpses into the airlock, throwing them in an unceremonious heap before venting them into the void of space. The voice of the queen and hive spoke up once more. "We are nearing completion of our conversion of the sugar vats into honey reserves for our voyage. Are you prepared for the journey?" He nodded, stepping over to the stasis pod and running a hand affectionately along the top. "I am, Queen and kin. Will you safeguard me as I sleep?" There was an affirmative and reassuring buzz. The small size and exoskeleton meant that the bees could not travel safely in hyperspace, instead relying on powerful engines and slingshot maneuvers to slowly but steadily make their ways across the stars. Still, as many times before, the voice of the hive was concerned about him. "Do you not miss your own kin? Your slumbers exceed their lifetimes, and it may be many more centuries before you walk amongst the grass of earth once more. We had a saying once that blessed is he who plants trees under whose shade he will never sit. I was fortunate enough to both plant those proverbial trees through my actions and the family I helped raise, and now I shall be able to see what they have become and what good they have founded in the world in my absence." As he sat back on a small metal wicker chair in the garden, a tired bee came to rest on his finger. Dabbing some water from his glass, he offered the droplet to the weary insect, who began to drink it with a wiggle of excitement. He nodded with gratitude and offered a word of thanks as a cluster of bees buzzed over, struggling with the weight of their cargo. They deposited a thumb-sized wad of bee pollen into his hand, a welcome and delicious treat he savored as he sat back and enjoyed hearing the humming of the honeybees filling the garden once again. It was unusual to be a human kept by bees, but it was an arrangement he would make again without hesitation. "So what do you think we're going to find?" one of the salvage crew asked the other. The speaker was a small, spindly creature, spider-like at a glance but with an odd flexibility not seen in Earth arachnids. Accompanying him was the muscle of the crew, a hulking lifeform whose people grew up on a dense, high-gravity moon, and as a result was able to shoulder a ridiculous amount of weight before she showed signs of slowing or tiring. "I'm not sure either," she rumbled, ducking low to fit into the passageway. It was certainly not a comfortably spacious ship for her species, but she found that few craft were typically suited to creatures of her size. However, her typically dour mood brightened as she lifted her ponderous head, breathing in great gulps of the stale, recycled air, and murmuring, "Something smells like food." What, like cooking? The smaller one asked, hopping up to perch on the front of her snout. She snorted at the ticklish sensation and made it click of disagreement. No, not cooked, but sweet. A carbon ring, short chains, and some unusual enzymes, if I'm not mistaken. Her companion blinked, then shrugged. If you say so. Their species lacked olfactory organs, or indeed much of anything to do with chemical ingestion or manipulation, instead relying on a sort of bootleg photosynthesis, sunning themselves and using the efficiently retained heat to power their needs for hours at a time. Still, they shivered and made a hiss of annoyance. It's cold in here. Let's get this over with. He pulled up a small hollow slate, and a blinking marker appeared in the passageway of the ship's hull. The lights were dim, the energy conservation mode having been engaged for untold ages, given the layer of still dust on everything. Both salvage crew were grateful that they had received a map at all, for often the most dangerous part of the job was finding out that a damaged vessel had a weakened floor or wall that could threaten injury or decompression to the uncautious. Remember, some of the human delegates had said there was both a rescue and recovery, and that would be paid for both. If we find any obstacles, best to be delicate about removing them. His companion just grunted in affirmative, annoyed and self-conscious for feeling like she had done a remarkably nimble job of avoiding crushing any of the protruding paneling or conduits thus far. She took another breath deep into the sensory pits in her muzzle and snorted, eyes narrowing. Something's ahead. Doesn't smell like the humans. The smaller alien grasped their cutting torch defensively, as if a 2-inch plasma flame would be sufficient to protect them from all the dangers his imagination could possibly conjure. Hopping up to follow the blinking path on the hollow slate, the indicator led to a closed door, a red glowing lock indicating that some part of the ship's power was still engaged to keep this closed and secured. The spindly being reached out to tap on the control panel, but was met with no reaction. He was about to turn back to his companion when he yelped in surprise and pulled his hand back as the console seemed to come alive, a fuzzy layer of swarming and buzzing creatures coating it within moments. As the small alien took a step back and then another out of fear and caution, the buzzing took on a strangely purposeful quality, a pattern slowly emerging as the buzzing repeated, until the smaller alien suddenly recognized it in shock. It was speech, the same tongue as the humans used, but nearly unintelligible as the swarm of tiny crawling and even occasionally flying creatures carefully buzzed in unison. It appeared that they were attempting to say something, although even as the smaller crew member watched, they could see a few of the creatures drooping and falling from the console, clearly exhausted by the effort. Finally, the buzzing speech became clear enough their translators were able to kick in and parse the words. A weak, echoing, and rough voice came through. Are you here to help or hurt? Before the spider-like alien could recover from their shock and respond, his companion spoke up, saying, To help, always. Delegates from the Federation of Human Worlds reached out to us about a distress signal they'd received, and the need for both the recovery and a rescue. I take it you're the rescue? The voice did not return, but the buzzing seemed to increase in enthusiasm. She chuckled and pulled forth a large canister that had been slung across her back, unscrewing the threaded seal on one end. After briefly glancing around their surroundings, she poured the contents into a makeshift basin formed from some pieces of scrap material. She quickly and carefully bent with her own tentacles into shape. As she was tapping the last of the liquid from the canister, her companion found his voice again, saying excitedly, The humans told us that this was good food you could use. Seems like simple hydrocarbon rings in some polar solvent. If my companion's nose here is anything go by, but it's suitable food, no? As if in answer, the walls seemed to surge, and hundreds of thousands of the small buzzing creatures issued forth, some flying, but most crawling to the basin. As the two salvage workers watched in amazement, the creatures began methodically consuming the nearly gel-like thick solution. As one wave of the diminutive creatures finished feeding, they seemed to melt away to the side, effortlessly making room for the next, and the aliens could see those that fed appeared notably more energetic, testing wings and taking flights, and in some cases even doing little excited circles and loop-de-loops with unexpected playfulness. After a time, the surge of creatures slowed to a trickle, even as the basin was nearly drained of the sweet syrup. The voice returned again, this time clear and strong, if still quiet and initially difficult for the translator to digest. We thank you for your swift arrival and this much-needed sustenance. Our own reserves were drained in the process of creating that which you still seek. The recovery? Asked the smaller, spindly creature. Are you saying that we're here to recover some food reserves? His tone was slightly disappointed, as the creature had been imagining all manner of unexplainable riches or mysterious artifacts. but he did his best to avoid sounding too dejected. No, it is likely not suitable as food any longer. It is difficult to explain, but might be easier if you saw for yourselves. Some of the creatures swarmed over the softly glowing lock, and as a few of them disappeared into the recess of the mechanism, a few seconds later the light pinged to vibrant green, and with a clink and a hiss slid open. Within was a room lined with gardening supplies, small hand tools, gloves, stacked bags of potting soil, and a few hoppers full of mixed seeds. But what dominated the room was the structure at the center of it. It was large, coming more than halfway up the larger salvager's torso, and almost seemed to glow from within as the soft tan-white material caught the light of the few intact lights in the room. The structure was a hexagonal column in shape, capped off with a slowly mounted dome, and at every angle it was covered with a very fine and precise texture of minute hexagons, the grid echoing the larger shape before them. But within, both aliens could see a form suspended in the center of the shape, something dark against the otherwise transparent yellow contents. The two salvagers also felt and heard a hush fall over the swarm around them, as if this was a place of sanctity. Heedful of that change of tone, the smaller of the pair calmed himself and said carefully, "Will we be allowed to look inside? I think we need to know what we are recovering to make sure we move it safely and properly." The hum of the swarm picked back up, as if a great discussion of many thousands of voices was being had in a form of language they had no hope of understanding. But at the end of it, the echoing voice replied in unison, "That is acceptable. Do not disturb the contents within, but we will reseal the container after you have opened it. The wax along the top can be easily parted with a hot implement such as the one you carry." Nodding, the spider-like alien clambered forward, pulling out his cutting torch again, but this time adjusting the flame width to be as thin as possible. Carefully, he melted through the seal, a warm and rich sweet aroma wafting out and causing his companion to hum in appreciation. He leaned the hexagonal wax lid backwards, and within the amber liquid inside, he could see the curled form of a human wispy hair around their head and wrinkles clear along their exposed skin, where the draped garments did not cover. They did not appear to have any kind of breathing, nor did they move or stir, and the salvager realized his suspicions earlier had been correct. "So how long has this one been dead, then?" The hive hummed, and the buzzing voice had a mournful tone. "The caretaker departed this world for the Garden of Infinite Flowers nearly 100 solar cycles ago." The alien's eyes winded shock as it looked back to the human, who looked as if they could awaken any moment. Even aboard a clean, space-going vessel, there should have still been enough microorganisms, both within the ship and within the deceased as well, to have consumed them with rot and reduced them to inorganic support structures within a few solar cycles at most. His companion had lumbered up to look inside the hexagonal interment and voiced the same thought aloud. "How has he been so vividly preserved?" she asked. "This does not smell like a volatile embalming mix." "No, indeed. This is our nectar, the gift that we give to the humans in exchange for their aid, and once upon a time, their protection and guidance." We had just departed the Sol system, and the caretaker had spent nearly 3 solar cycles catching up and learning of what had become of his friends and family over the centuries he had been gone. But as we crossed into open space, we were struck by a solar pulse, ejected from a star so far away it could not be seen with the naked eye. It overloaded our systems, causing electronics to crash and his stasis pod to unseal. He did his best to help us repair the damage, send out distress call after distress call in every direction, as we'd so thoroughly lost our bearings and no navigational systems had survived the initial surge. We did our best to conserve resources. Indeed, we had enough food and supplies that we would be able to weather ages adrift. But the human is solitary, not one of many in a cycle of birth and death, and he was aged for his species. Despite all of our care and attention, he passed. Before he crossed over into the garden, he spoke of his lone regret, which was the hope to be buried with his family, descendants, and kin in a graveyard on Earth. Although he did not ask of us, we constructed this vessel to contain him and preserve him so that his final wishes could be fulfilled. "And you just had all of this preservation fluid lying around?" asked the salvager, before being shushed for the interruption by his companion. The swarm of creatures appeared to be amused by the question. "No, for this is actually something we produce. A refined nutrient mix, suitable for preservation of sustenance, or anything else for that matter. We donated a large swath of our reserves to this vessel to offer our caretaker a gentle repose while we waited for aid to arrive. It reduced the number of cycles we would be able to weather in half, and we are fortunate you arrived when you did. for we would have only survived a scant few additional cycles, and even then not without massive losses towards what was left of our people. The two salvagers nodded, and the smaller carefully pushed the wax lid back into place. Immediately, swarms of bees began resealing the container, and a few minutes later, they were able to carefully slide it onto an anti-grav cart platform, the larger alien carefully pulling it behind her as she navigated her ways through the cramped and damaged ship and back to the salvage crew's own vessel. Underscore, 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 underscore. Do you require any special accommodations before we depart? The human delegates had warned us of your sensitivity to hyperspeed, so my companion and I have prepared stasis pods of our own for the journey to the nearest port of call. The swarm had all followed them through, but a cluster landed in front of them, at the airlock back to the damaged ship they had abandoned. No, you have shown us the additional food reserves we will require, and we are already making progress to set up temporary quarters within the spaces of your ship, as well as performing minor repairs here and there where needed. The two salvage members were surprised at how quickly the bees had taken to their ship, but were pleased to see a notable increase in engine core efficiency and a decrease in minor errors cropping up across their flight command console. Already there were large and looming white wax combs seeming to grow from the walls and ceiling near the corners of each of the rooms as the swarm settled in. The cluster at the airlock seemed to almost watch as the door sealed shut and their former home drifted back empty into the void. I am sorry about your ship, the smaller alien offered, understanding how he might feel if he were suddenly forced to take refuge on someone else's vessel and leave his familiar one behind. However, the swarm seemed determined and upbeat as it replied, "Our kind is no stranger to relocation and adaptation." As they spoke, the two aliens could see at the center of the cluster of bees was one with a speck of brilliantly colored iridescent paint on an abdomen notably longer than the bees around them. The cluster of these bees flew over to perch atop the wax container with the preserved human within, and indeed this quickly seemed to be the spot that most of them began gathering at. Any bees not actively building combs within walls or performing repairs seemed to cluster and swarm around it. Soon they had hidden any trace of the pale container beneath a mass of rippling and shifting minute bodies. Our kind has known since time immemorial that a home is not where you are, but who you surround yourself with. Not going to tell you again, little girl, grunted the tallest and most numerous armed of the three brutes, staring down Mera. You can either give us your ration chips, or we can break you apart and take them for ourselves. Mera glared at the three and cursed herself for taking one of the back alleys through the way station's outer ring. She had seen them behind her earlier when she had received her daily allotment of the ration chips, a common-sense courtesy offered to all residents of the way station or any guests passing through. However, she had not seen them for some time afterwards, and had naively assumed that they had found another mark elsewhere to harass. Then one had stepped out in front of her, and another behind as she crossed through one of the cross alleys, no one nearby to hear her, even if she yelled for help. While she could the bustling trade row and the edges of colorful stalls and much heavier foot traffic, it generated enough noise that she would have to shout herself hoarse in order for the echoes to rise above the background din of the merchants peddling their wares. "I've got my 3 chips for the day, same as any of you," she shot back, glaring at the muggers. The leader of the trio chuckled mirthlessly, saying, "Yes, but it appears my friends have lost theirs, or perhaps they were too hungry and ate it all up already. In either case, we need more, and yours will do nicely." His voice lost the facsimile of playfulness as he said flatly and directly, "This is your last opportunity to give us those rations, before they have to scrape you off the walls." In response, Mera just spat on the ground in front of the hulking alien and retorted, "Eat glass for all I care." The leader of the muggers gaped in astonishment for a moment before he closed his mouth, and with a shrug, sent a balled fist hurtling into her stomach. Mera coughed, gagging slightly at the sensation. One of the henchmen holding her arm against the corridor paneling sounded almost regretful as they said, "Best to just give up those chips now. I've seen him beat someone till they stopped breathing, just for giving him trouble." The leader of the gang balled up a pair of scaled fists this time, but before he punched, he paused. He narrowed his eyes and said, "Whoever the hell you are, scram. This doesn't concern you." Still almost bent over double, Mera looked up to see a massive vacuum suit, suitable for spacewalks in low atmosphere or hard vacuum conditions. It was for a large species, so massive that it scraped against the sides of the alleyway, and a curious sight given that the conditions within the way station rings typically covered most species' respiration, temperature, and humidity needs. Those creatures that found the condition to be slightly off usually went for less bulky solutions, small supplemental gas tanks or lightweight liquid-saturated fabrics to stay moist. But while the figure was large, it did not appear to be armed, and the movements seemed somewhat uncoordinated, possibly inebriated to Mira's untrained eye. You know, friend, maybe you didn't hear me, but it's time for you to move along. Else I'm going to start asking after what tribute you're going to give us for inconveniencing me. The lumbering suit took a step forward. It was oddly quiet, the sound of fabric hitting the flooring with far less weight behind it than Mera would have guessed. The leader of the ruffians also seemed perplexed at the lack of weight from such a massive shape, stepping forward and flicking out the fire knife that he had been threatening the human with. It was a few inches long, with a crackling and low-quality plasma emitter providing a stuttering crimson wedge of energy barely as long and wide as his hand. He waved it towards the suited figure who paused, but did not retreat at the display of the weapon. Grateful that someone had taken an interest in her situation, Mera was still worried that whoever this seemingly confused bystander was, they did not appear to be prepared for violence, and she would have loathed to be responsible for someone else getting hurt because of her stubbornness. "Listen to the scaly snotball there," she said, the leader whipping around to glare at her, a promise of revenge for the insult clearly visible in the way he played with and gripped the crackling energy knife. The large figure turned to regard her, and despite the opaque visor hiding their face, Mera felt suddenly exposed and scrutinized. She managed to pull a hand free, waving away at the suited figure before her arm was caught and pinned back in place as she said, "Go on, I don't want you getting hurt too, please." The large figure seemed to take a step back, and the gang leader snickered. "Just goes to show that because you're big doesn't mean you can't also be a coward," he said, chuckling wetly, before turning back to Mera and flipping the knife around in his hand. "Now, what was that about a scaly snotball? I don't take too kindly to being insulted by those who owe me their dues." As he flipped the blade around, Mera clenched her eyes shut, wishing that her search hadn't come to an end here on his backwater station. But then an odd clomping sound caused her to look up, just in time to see the astonished gang members being smashed into by the suited figure, who had become galloping down the hallway, building momentum, even as they scraped against the sides and protruding panels on the hallway. While the creature was clearly not as dense as one might expect, there was still sufficient speed and mass to knock the gang members over, spilling them against a set of empty metal storage crates that were now filled with refuse and rotting food scraps. The soft-spoken follower who had warned Mera took this opportunity to escape, sprinting down the hallway towards the distant ring of the market street, dripping garbage juices from the bits of spoiled fruit hanging from him. The other gang member quickly brushed off the scraps of packaging and herb dust canisters that had fallen on her before getting to her feet. But although she'd squared her shoulders up to fight the interloper, she had paused, not daring to approach Mera, as the enormous suited shape loomed. It began to rear onto its hind legs, lashing out with the front ones. They didn't make contact, but it was enough of a show that the gang member took a step back. She instead went to help lift up her leader, who instead swore at her and swatted away the offered hand, getting heavily to his feet as something pink and clumpy oozed down his vest. His knife had skidded away down the hallway, and he was unarmed, glaring daggers instead at the intruder who appeared to ignore him. The suited alien turned his best they could in the slightly wider alcove until they faced Mera. "Are you safe, little human came?" The voice that crackled from the speaker on the suit was echoing in harmony, as if hundreds of distinct voices spoke as one. She nodded, still confused as to who her savior was. "Thanks for the help," she said hesitantly. "And you are?" "We are collective, but you may address us as queen and kin." Mara nodded slowly before asking, "Why did you save me?" The lumbering figure lifted its head towards her, visored face still inscrutable, and spoke patiently again. "We have a connection with humans and saw an opportunity for us to help." The voice cut out as the unified words became a buzz of confusion, pain, and surprise. Shocked, Mera could see that the gang leader had recovered his knife and had plunged it into the chest of this figure's spacesuit. But to both the human and the alien's surprise, the figure did not immediately fall, nor did the wound begin to bleed. Instead, insects began to pour out, dozens of them, buzzing and humming as the air filled with the swarming creatures. A few stings was all it took to send the other gang minion fleeing, screaming down the hall as she slapped at her already visible welts along her skin. but the leader just chuckled. Mera could see many of the tiny creatures all across the scales, but it appeared they were too thick to have any impact. Well, well, he said with cruel glee, ignoring Mera for the moment to focus on the deflating suit and the growing swarm of insects that had filled it. Something tells me that you little pests aren't going to be especially fond of clouds of acid. Mera could see his chest and neck flaps begin to engorge, filling with a bile that she had seen others of his species use before, spraying out a mist that could dissolve cloth and burn skin. However, as the gang leader turned, chuckling thickly as his glands filled with the dangerous concoction, there was a loud thunk, and he groaned and slumped forward. Behind him, Mera sighed in relief, slowly lowering the metal storage crate she had hit him with, and grateful that it appeared to have been heavy enough to finally put him down for the count. Almost immediately, the swarming insects rallied, going from an indistinct mass to begin collecting back at the suit. As she watched, it began re-inflating it as if a child's balloon being pumped. She could also see the cauterized cut in the suit was knitted back together with some sort of organic glue the insects spat out, until soon the only sign that the suit had been sundered at all was a thin, lumpy line of off-colored paste along the cut. A pair of the buzzing insects hadn't managed to make it back into the suit before it was sealed shut, and gently Mera held out her hand, giggling and flinching, but then standing firm as she felt them tickle on her hand. The massive suit leaned forward, the visor sliding open to reveal a solid mass of insects swirling and churning within. She held out her hand, and the two that had rested on her flew off to join the others before the visor slid back down. Our thanks for the aid, human. There was a loud cacophony of uncoordinated buzzing, and then a moment later, the voice spoke again. A consensus has been reached. We are seeking one of your kind to help us rebuild, for our hive and caretaker were both lost. Would you be willing to aid us? Glancing around at the dingy alley, Mera nodded, holding up a finger as she said, I have some conditions, though, as I'm not here just for fun. I'm looking for something, but if you're willing to help me find it, I'll gladly help you deal with obstacles like this scaly blob of snot, she said, giving the unconscious gang leader a kick, eliciting a groan from his still form. We thank you, caretaker. Now begins our first task, for we must find a new ship to rebuild within. This form was given to us by another kindly being, but it is not suitable to venture between the stars in. Glancing out towards the docking ring, she could barely make out the shape of her missing parents' research vessel, right where she had last parked it. Mera smiled. You're always welcome to crash at my place, she said, taking the suit by one hand and leading them down the passage towards the docking ring.